everybody. This is Byron Jacobs of dmbpoker.com. As you probably know, we do poker books. I've got a few of them behind me here. That's just a small selection. That's not all of them. But today I'm delighted to have Fernando Habegger, who I'll be talking to about the book that he wrote for us, which we're very pleased with. Is doing very well. It's Mastering Small Stakes Pot Limit Omaha. Bit of a primer for people less familiar with the game, or maybe play a little but don't maybe have the basics completely nailed down. So Fernando, hi, how are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Good. It's great to have you here. Now, maybe you could tell us, before we get going with the kind of heavy PLO stuff, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, like what you maybe did before you came to poker and what kind of drew you to poker, and also specifically why PLO, because obviously you're a PLO expert.
Absolutely. I started playing poker in 2005, which for anyone new to poker were sort of the golden years when Moneymaker won the WSOP and poker became really big all over the world. I started playing back then and moved into online poker quite quickly. And from about 2005 until 2010, I played primarily Hold'em. And then in 2010, I noticed the games became a lot tougher and a lot of people read a lot of books about poker, myself included. But I couldn't quite break through to the mid-stakes levels, essentially. And I was quite frustrated because I was playing on full-head poker back then, full ring, no limit Hold'em, and I was making some pretty good money and winning at the games, but full tilt basically fall apart. So I had to move to Poker Stars to 6-max Hold'em. And I thought it was the same game, but it really wasn't. And the opponents were also very different, that were much, much better. So I actually became quickly a losing player, and I became quite fed up with the game, essentially. So I started to think about how can I make this work for me. And with this, I mean my poker career. I wasn't playing full time at this point, but I definitely had ambitions to do so. And I heard about Pot Limit Omaha. And my idea back then in 2010 was, well, if I learn and pick up Pot Limit Omaha and the game grows, then I can actually be ahead of the curve at one point.
Sure.
And even though I started playing poker in 2005, I never really felt like I was ahead of the curve. So in 2010, I started picking up the first couple of books, courses around Omaha, and I started learning the game, and I quickly became actually successful. And then to the point where in 2011, I could turn this into a full-time profession, and I stuck with the game from 2011 till today.
Okay, that's great. So obviously, you're known as a very strong player. I think it would definitely, you're regular at the high stakes tables, etc., etc. What has made you balance your activities more and also have a teaching and coaching as element to what you do? What encouraged you to develop that?
Well, I think from a young age, before even discovering poker, I always enjoyed the process of picking up something new, like information or a skill. And then the way I'm processing that is usually by talking to others, teaching, collaborating with others, for example, or presenting things. So I always like the idea of learning and teaching in one not in one concept, but in one go. So for example, I played in my youth volleyball, and funny enough, I just restarted playing volleyball up to a pretty high level. And I was teaching 2 teams and playing in one team myself. And that was just 1 year after picking up volleyball myself. So I was always interested in picking up a new skills, thinking about how it works, getting educated on it, and then teaching it. Because in the process of teaching, you get a lot of feedback, and you also start to think about how can you shorten the process of understanding certain ideas and concepts. And that's, at the end of the day, in all my teaching, the main priority is the way I think about teaching is it's all about structuring and prioritizing information so that someone else can pick up that information much quicker. So I always teach poker conceptually, which means today, almost any variation of poker works with solvers. And solvers is basically just a mass aggregation of information and data in Hold'em or PLO. And so the job of any poker player, and then consequently of any teacher, is to organize that data and then put some sort of structure and some sort of priority to it. And the way I do that is by creating concepts. And concepts is something that doesn't exist in the solver world. There's no need for that, because the solver just works with all the numbers, just does all the math and runs all the algorithms, doesn't care about concepts. But humans, they have to think about sentences and ideas. And what I do is I take solver outputs and put them into easy consumable ideas that then can be applied and remembered by humans. For example, in the book, just as a quick reference, I bundle hands together into one category, and then I attach characteristics and ideas to this category that can then be understood by humans. A solver doesn't think about the categories. It just looks at data points. Okay, this hand in the algorithm is making this much EV, so it has to play this way. That's it.
Okay, that's good. You've actually kind of answered my next question, because what I was going to say in the context of doing this book, I remember that when you delivered the script, obviously I get a lot of scripts from a lot of different poker players, and they usually have good information, but they're not always structured particularly logically. This was like structured like amazingly well. It was the thought processes were obviously very clear. You know, you were very clear what you wanted to do and how you wanted to do it, and that was the thing that really impressed me about the script that was delivered. Obviously the information was very good too. And I was actually going to ask you if you've always had this kind of logical approach to anything that you've tried to learn, but you've kind of pretty much answered that with your extended answer to the previous question. So that's good. So yeah. What would you say is the target market for this book? I mean, hopefully anyone who plays PLO would get something out of it, but who's going to really benefit from reading this?
Well, the way I understand poker, and I played a lot of different variations in poker. I played Hold'em cash, sit and goes. I played hyper sit and goes. I played tournaments. I played live poker, PLO, 5-card Omaha now. I also learned some high-low. I learned 8 game at some point. So I picked up a lot of different games throughout the years. And I think what's most important is to understand the fundamental base of the how a game is structured. And by structure, I don't talk about strategy. I talk about how many hands are possible in Omaha. Okay, 270,000, for example. Okay, so how do we structure categories out of that? How do I make sense of hands in general? Like in Hold'em, for example, you look at ace king and ace queen, and you have a grid with 169 different combos, from ace king up to 7 deuce, from aces to deuces. So you organize that quite easily, and everyone in the world that picks up poker sort of starts with a preflop chart. Now in Omaha, if you're just starting out, what you need organization. You need to understand, okay, look, I have 270,000 hands. How do I organize them into categories? And why is it important to organize them into categories? And for post, it's the same thing. What are the most important things? In the book, we use the 4 pillars of post analysis. So I basically give you a tool set that helps you to think for yourself about how to dissect any spot in the game. And so I think what's more important than developing knowledge about every single part in the game tree, what's more important is to have a tool set with you that allows you to analyze situations yourself. For example, in live poker, you play a lot of multi-way pots, or in low stakes poker, a lot of multi-way pots. And when you play online, you generally tend to play shallower stacks as situations. You're 100 big blinds deep, your opponents might buy in for like 40 big blinds, and then live, you're playing sometimes extremely deep. So you need to understand, how does the stack to pot ratio, so how much is in the middle compared to your stack, impact your decision making? And that's a crucial point in PLO, because in PLO, equity is way more important than in Hold'em. Hold'em is a frequency-based game. So you have a hand and you tell yourself, okay, I have to bluff this hand, for example, 50% of the time, and then check it 50% of the time. I'm generally not that good at frequencies. That's why I didn't pick up Hold'em for the last 10 years, basically. Omaha is a lot more about understanding how good is this combo draw in this situation. And with situation, I mean, how many players in the pot? What is the stack to pot ratio? And what are more or less the ranges in preflop? Are we talking about 3-bet ranges or single raise pot ranges? So I give you a tool set to take all that information into account and structure a logical and easy to understand thought process. And I think that's important to scale up the skill of becoming much better later on. What I usually see is when someone asks me, is the way you teach good for live poker? Then I would say the answer is yes, because it is much more based on this tool set instead of talking about all these like really individual specific situations. Like we also talk about it in terms of illustrative concepts. We use a hand in the book and say we have over 100 different hand examples in the book and say, hey, look, here's a hand and here's a concept and here's the way you can combine it. But I think what's much more important is to show the reader of the book the way we analyze this hand is by using concept A here and then concept B there. And then you can do that yourself in whatever spot you're in. So I think it's very good for people who are just starting out or are already in the game, but never learned the game from a very structural, logical perspective.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if people are coming to PLO, this is, as I said before, a very logically and well-structured book. So you could do a lot worse than start with that. Now, obviously, a lot of people who take up PLO are, as with you, they're going to come from a no-limit background. So what kind of skills that they have from No Limit are more or less completely transferable to PLO? And what elements of their knowledge do they need to completely relearn? Can you give some insight into that?
I think that's a great question. A lot of people don't think about it that way. When they move from No Limit Hold'em to PLO, they always focus on what they don't know. Okay, I have no idea about Omaha, so it's hard to start. But the thing is, you have a lot of ideas about poker, and that gives you a huge advantage that you shouldn't just push aside. It is quite discouraging to think about any other poker variation as you, as the new player, have no idea about the game. That's completely not true. You still have an understanding of some of the most important concepts. For example, in Hold'em, just as in Omaha, big cards are absolutely key. And in Hold'em back in the days, 2005, you would look at Daniel Negreanu playing the 7-6 of hearts. And everyone back then thought, well, these suited connectors are extremely good. They're amazing. They can crack aces. And today we know, good luck with your 7-6 of hearts. I'd rather play like ace king or pocket queens. And because big cards are just going to win a lot more money. And in Omaha, there's no difference. When you move from No Limit Hold'em to Omaha, you look at 4 cards that connect very well, like an 8-7-6-5, for example, so that we call this a rundown. You might be very intrigued the way a No Limit Hold'em novice player back then looked at 7-6 hearts and thought, well, this hand looks really interesting. It can have so much potential. The reality, though, is big cards win. And that's the same thing in No Limit Hold'em and in PLO. A second concept is that is less, I would say less transferable, like something that people have to relearn a little bit, is that in Omaha, preflop hand strength is dynamic. In Hold'em, it's quite static, which means pocket queens are pocket kings, and they're always really strong. It basically doesn't matter if your opponent has a 5% range or a 15% range or a 50% range or a 80% range. It really doesn't matter. Like kings are quite static in Hold'em. That's not true in Omaha. In Omaha, there are a lot of hands pre-flop that have a sort of an inflection point. And that inflection point occurs when your opponent very likely has ace-ace in Omaha. So we call it ace-ace-XX, so XX for 2 side cards. Then the strength of your hand can drop a lot. For example, let's say you look at a hand like King, King, 8-9. So you got King, King, 8-9 in Omaha. This is generally speaking a very strong hand. Now, if your opponent has aces, though, you will have to outdraw the aces holding King, King, 8-9, right? That's the way you win against that hand. In that case, you rather have something like 8-7-6-5, so a rundown, because you have more chances to outdraw ace-ace. That doesn't mean, though, that 8-9-7-6 is a better hand than King, King, 8-9. It just means that in this specific instance, the hand strength is dynamic and there's an inflection point towards the big pairs and the ace-x hands that become a lot weaker once your opponent very likely shows up with aces. So there is a little bit more dynamicism going on when it comes to proof of hand strength. We call this also calibration, so the process of calibrating your hand strength towards the situation at hand. And what ties in with that is in Omaha, there are a lot of multi-way pots in beginner player, in beginner play and in live play. And when you play multi-way pots, the first thing people think about is, especially in live poker, is I got to play like my opponents. Okay, everyone plays loose. I got to play loose as well. It's quite social as well, this idea. If you are at a live poker table and everyone plays basically almost every hand, which you will find in Omaha very frequent, it's quite intuitive to think to yourself, everyone plays every hand. Like, I'm going to play some hands as well now. But that's actually not the correct way to play. When you have to win post-flop against more opponents, it implies that you need a higher quality of a starting hand because you need to win against 4 or 5 players. So you need to have a very nutted hand, and a lot of the hands that are fine heads up don't do as well 5 or 4-way. So actually the correct exploit, you can say, against a very loose environment is to play tight and to focus on hands that can dominate your opponents. Now, what's what's weird about that is that people think, if my opponents play a really bad strategy, like they play almost all the starting hands pre-flop, shouldn't I be able to just print off them in every single hand? And the answer is no. You have to play tight. But what it means is the hands you do play, they make a lot more money than in a normal environment. So once you pick up those very strong hands, you're going to be playing them, you're going to be re-raising, 3-betting, you're going to have 3-4 customers that will call. And in that instance, you're going to make a lot more money because you get more action. So it's not the amount of hands that will make you a lot of money. It's the types of hands you play in the right spot. And that's a little bit different in Omaha than in No Limit Hold'em. And then lastly, I would say understanding how stack the pot ratio influences your decision-making is absolutely key in Omaha, where in Hold'em, it's a little bit less relevant. So for example, in Hold'em, when you have top pair, top kicker, in most situations, that's pretty good. And you can probably bet 3 streets. You can probably get your stack in a 3-bet pot, for example. That's all fine. In Omaha, 1 pair is rarely good on the flop. Like you shouldn't like push the action too much with 1 pair. But if the stacked pot ratio shrinks, you're in a 3-bet pot, you're in a 4-bet pot, which means maybe there's only, let's say there's 100 in the middle, you have only 400 back, so the stacked pot ratio would be 4. 1 pair could be good enough to just pot into your opponent and go with your hand. And when you are used to single raise pots a lot, where you need big draws to justify putting a lot of chips in the middle, you're going to make large mistakes in Omaha when when the stacked pot ratio shrinks. And that's a big problem, because when does the stacked pot ratio shrink? In big pots. And you don't want to make mistakes in big pots because they're very costly. So what you have to do is you have to adapt your stack of threshold for shallow situations correctly. We talk about this in the book, of course. Here's a 4-bet pot. Here's a 3-bet pot where aces, for example, are good enough to just pot the flop and go with your hand, even though you have no major draw. And that distinction is kind of new for No Limit Hold'em players that they have to become familiar with.
Okay, that's it kind of. I've been having worked on with you on the book. I've been trying to develop my game a little bit in the last year, and that's the thing that's really struck me is the difference from No Limit. Is, as you were saying, it's the game seems a lot more fluid. You know, it's kind of more static in No Limit. You know, like you say, a good hand is usually a good hand as it progresses through the hand, whereas everything really changes like street to street. And the other thing. That has struck me as well is the concept of blockers, which seems to me to be far more important in PLO than it is in No Limit. Yeah, it's maybe a little part of No Limit, but would that be reasonable to say that, you know, thinking about blockers is like a much more important part of the game in PLO, because that can really influence strategy where you push hands for bluffs and things like that.
The way I would think about it is in Omaha, you have a lot more information than in Hold'em, because you have those 2 additional side cards. And as you have more info, let's say on the flop, for example, in Hold'em, you get 5 cards, 2 in your hand and 3 on the board. In Omaha, you get 3 on the board, 4 in your hand, you get 7 cards. So you have more information, and that should drive your decision. As solvers got introduced in Hold'em, people were starting to pay attention a lot more to side cards or blocker effects. And now every Hold'em player talks about, oh, I have the 7 blocker, so I'm going to use this combo to bluff. And that's obviously the way a solver thinks about things in Hold'em. It's quite nuanced, though, as you say. Like, even if you don't have that much of an idea about the perfect blockers in Hold'em, you're going to be fine. In Omaha, you can really abuse the power of blockers a lot more, where you know your opponent can't have the nuts, or it's very unlikely to have the nuts, so you can apply a lot of pressure. In Hold'em, if your opponent represents the nuts and you got a pretty strong hand, you just call down. And if you have a set and the board brings out a straight or a flush, like, you probably just call and you hope for the best. In Omaha, you really can't do that, because in Omaha, it's much more likely your opponent has a big hand that you have to be more careful. And that in reverse means if you have a very good blocker to the nuts, you can apply a lot more pressure. So in any game where you gain more information, let's say we compare 4-card Omaha with 5-card Omaha with 6-card Omaha, as you add more cards into your starting hand, you can apply more pressure, and you should and your decision making should be driven a lot more from that information that you have in your hand, and that also influences the way you're bluffing. And also value bet. So just as a basic example, a lot of people don't think about is, if you have a flush in Omaha, which means you have 2 of the same suit in your hand. You can also have 3 of the same suit in your hand or 4 of the same suit in your hand. And that has a big removal effect. So that means you probably want to value bet smaller. You probably want to induce potentially. Like it's just likely your opponent has a flush himself. And so you want to make decisions that take that into account. Let's say in Omaha, you have something like let's say there are 3 hearts on the board and you have the ace king of hearts versus the ace 4 of hearts. Of course, you have side cards, but just as an example, when you have ace king of hearts, you have a lot less EV because your opponent cannot have the second nut flush. But at the same time, your opponent also cannot have the second nut flush blocker. So he is less likely to call you with the flush and less likely to bluff you with the blocker. If you have the ace 4 of hearts, that reverses. He could have the king of hearts himself, just bluff that card, or he can have the king high flush. So now suddenly you're taking different lines because of those blockers. So usually when people think about blockers, they just think about the nut flush blocker, but it goes a lot further than that in reality. And it's not necessarily something that you're trying to like master overnight, but it's something you start paying more attention to. You have to develop an eye for it and a feel for it and understand, oh, in this situation, blockers matter a lot. In this situation, I do have a blocker, but it doesn't really matter that much. And just as a quick example, if the board is like 2 5s, 2 4 6, so like 2 5s will block the straight. Now 2 5s or 5 4 aren't really played that much in Omaha. So like even if you have those blockers, it doesn't matter as much because if your opponent is good in the game or smart about the game, he should realize that you don't really have a lot of straights anyway. So in that case, the blockers aren't worth as much. And understanding those subtle nuances is really what understanding blockers is all about.
Okay, that's great. One thing that I'm interested to hear your opinion on is where would you say the money is to be made in PLO? I mean, is it, where are the better players exploiting the weaker? Is it with starting hand selection? Is it play on the turn? Is it with, where does the money come from?
Sure. So the main thing new players think about in Omaha is I got to protect my hand. That's like all they care about. And you saw this also in Hold'em again, 2005 to 2010. People were saying things such as, well, if you trapped your opponent and now he has you beat, it's your fault. Why did you trap with the aces? Why didn't you jam your top pair? Now he made a backdoor flush on you. It's your fault, right? And obviously today we know that this is going to happen. This is the price to pay if you are trying to induce a bluff from your opponent. Omaha isn't as far as you basically, as in history, see everything repeat itself. And the same thing is true for Omaha. And because I know Hold'em pretty well from back in the days, I see the same thought processes repeat themselves, the same biases towards overprotecting their hands. So what's the problem with overprotecting your hand? Well, if you have a good hand you feel like is worth protecting, you start betting. Okay, so that means if you check, you probably don't have a good hand. And that's really the problem with beginning players in Omaha. When they check, they usually don't have a good hand and they will end up folding way too often. Now, another issue with overprotection is a lot of people that overprotect, they tend to bet way too large. So they just pot out. On the flop, they're in the big blind. They flop a good hand like 2 pair or straight. They see a flush draw out there. They're just going to pot right into you because they think, oh, I don't want to give a good price. I just want to protect my hand. And so the problem with that, again, is if the good hands are potting, that means when they're not potting, they have a really weak hand. So what tends to work really well is to move the decisions to the turn and the river when your opponent gives away more information. What I mean by that is on the flop, maybe your opponent has an auto check. So they're in the big blind, they might think to themselves, well, I'm not the aggressor, I'm just going to check. Okay, so let's say you check back. On the turn, he's going to start overprotecting his hand, which means once you see a check twice, they check the flop and the turn, they probably are really weak. And I usually say to starting players that are playing really weak pools, I say, if your opponent checks 3 times to you and you're on the river and you don't think you win based on the hand you have, just bet. They checked 3 times. They probably just don't have much. And if you just check and lose, it's really your own fault. So people are very overprotective. And once they check more and more, they tend to have very weak hands. And they also use really large sizing. So what that also means is if you have the nuts and your opponent pots into you, you will know, or you should know, this player is going to go with this hand. He's not bluffing. He feels like he has a strong hand because he really signals it very obvious. And then you just raise right away. So you know when to slow play and you know when to fast play. If your opponent shows a lot of weakness, maybe you should slow play a good hand. If your opponent just pots right into you, you can fast play the really strong hands. And if your opponent checks to you, I would generally maybe start working with like smaller bets overall, because what smaller bets do is they incentivize your opponent to continue with a wider range of hands. And a lot of people are not comfortable doing that. What they will do is they see a small bet, they look at their hand and think, my hand is good or it's bad. It's very binary. If it's bad, they just fold. If it's medium, they call. You know you might be able to bluff them. If it's strong, they will always just raise you because overprotective mindset. So with a small bet, you can get a lot of information out of your opponents, and then you can leverage that on the turn in the river pretty well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the things that I found, going through the learning process myself, one of the things that I found quite difficult to adjust to is what you identify a lot in the book is talking about protecting your checking range. And sometimes you have like what look like really strong hands, like even bottom set, something like that. And you say, no, you've got to use this to protect the check. Whereas my instinct is, oh no, I must bet this hand. It's so that's really interesting.
Maybe one way to think about that, just as a side note, is when we look at a very strong hand, we in our minds think about how many streets of bets is this hand worth. So you look at top set and you think, this is worth all of it. All my stack, this is how much this hand is worth. But the problem with that is it's not really about how much this hand is worth. It's more about this situation that occurs right now. How much can we get out of our opponent and in which way? And let's say our opponent has a very weak range, or he shows a lot of signals of weakness, then we look at our very strong hand, and the main thing we should think about is how much and in which way can we squeeze out the most out of this player. Of course, our hand is willing to put all the chips in the middle, but that's not going to happen, especially in Omaha when I call this like having an overkill, which means you have like too many blockers to the board. You have the two pair and the flush draw and the straight draw together. You have it all. Of course, you want to stack your opponent, but that's not going to happen because you block the board completely. So you have to find other creative ways to squeeze out maybe one bet out of your opponent, even though you have a very strong hand. And of course, once in a while, he will check raise, you will get the money in and you will stack him. But very often, when you have a very strong hand, your opponent does not have a very strong hand because you're blocking the very strong hand. And that's a lot more the case than in Hold'em. In Hold'em, when you have a top pair or you have an overpair, your opponent can still have top pair, or your opponent might call it down for middle pair as a bluff catcher. That's not going to happen in Omaha. In Omaha, in order to like stack an opponent, they need a strong hand as well. So in order to overcome this bias, what I would think about is your mind has a natural bias towards attaching a certain value of bets that goes in when you have a very strong hand on the flop or on the turn. I would distance myself from that and say, let's look at the situation. How can we get the most out of our opponent? And what you will find that it's oftentimes, hey, I don't think we can get 2 bets out of this guy. Maybe we should check and maybe he can bluff the river. And then the pot is smaller and you feel disappointed. But the reality is if you would have bet the turn, they just fold.
Okay. One thing that occurs to me that there'd be a lot of players who really like playing no limit and are curious about PLO and might like to transition, but they really love playing tournaments. And I know that PLO kind of has a reputation as a cash game more than a tournament game. So what would you say to players like that? Is there a good PLO tournament experience to be had, or do they need to think about actually playing cash?
I think moving into tournaments is a great idea because the tournament format itself is a skill set as well. There's ICM, final table, the stack sizes are lower, and there are money jumps to be thinking about, and just the whole tournament dynamic is unique. So when you move from a no limit hold'em tournament player to a PLO tournament player, or you play a PLO tournament as a no limit hold'em tournament player, you bring a certain skill set with you that will help you against the cash game PLO players in the first place. That's a good advantage to have there. Then secondary, as the stacks get shallower, the mistakes you make become smaller overall because you can't really quote unquote punt it off. Oh, I think you froze it for a second. Are you still here?
Yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Oh, you're back. You just froze there for a moment. You're back, right?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. We can carry on.
Yeah. So as a tournament player, you already bring in some experience in the tournament format. That's helpful. And then secondary, as you play shallower stacks, the most difficult spots in Omaha fall away, which is we're playing flop, turn, and river, and you have a massive decision for all your chips in a cash game at 150 big blinds in a 3-bet pot. That's not going to happen in a tournament. In a tournament, you're primarily going to play pre-flop and the flop, and then the money usually goes in. And so that makes the learning process shorter because you primarily have to focus on pre-flop and flop and not as much on 3-4 bet pots, flop, turn, river, check raising this street and that street. So I think that's going to help people to jump into it and get a more solid foundation. Also, in tournaments, as I said in the beginning, in Omaha, big cards are still the winning cards, like, are still the strongest hands. And that's even more true when you're shallow. So if you come from a no-limit background, you obviously have a little bit of a limited understanding of pre-flop hand strength in Omaha. But if you just focus on high cards for tournaments, it's a really good starting point to also have decent success in PLO tournaments.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Fernando. And I'd just like to say once more, this book, it's available from our site, dmbpoker.com. It's as you've been listening to Fernando, he's obviously got fantastic understanding of PLO and teaches and instructs the game in a very logical way. And you can find, you can get the benefit of all his wisdom from this book. You can get it from our site and also from all the usual online retailers. And I would also encourage you to go to Fernando's own site, the PLOMastermind site, where he has there's tons of coaching materials available, and there's some tremendous stuff on there. Would you like to say a little bit about your own site just to wrap this up?
Sure. So we started the PLOMastermind in 2018, and it basically compiles all the things I know about the game together with a few other coaches. We talk about different stakes, different variations of the game, and it's just a continuum of the structured approach that I laid out in the book. We go deeper into pre-flop categories. We talk more about different variations and deeper play. I mean, at the end of the day, the concepts, the fundamental concept that I build is the same in the book or in the mastermind. So like if you enjoy reading a book, if you won't stick with it anyway. So I would give the book a shot and see, is this type of a game something for you or it isn't? And then you can like follow that up in the PLO Mastermind. It's similar to me where I played No Limit Hold'em for like 5-6 years, like really serious, and I learned everything I could about it. But once I jumped into Omaha, I realized this game, which is a lot more based on equities than a frequency-based game, is a lot more, it suits my personality or my strength and skill set a lot better. So I think everyone should like give this a try to see if that also is true for them. And then they will oftentimes realize that, first of all, poker is poker and there are different games and you can exchange the variables. And at the end of the day, it's still poker and you will probably still like it, even if it's 4-card or 5-card or 2 cards or tournaments or cash games. At the end of the day, we're all here because we like poker. And I wouldn't be too afraid to like jump into a new format. And then that being said, you might enjoy a different game more because a lot of people, what they enjoy about picking up a new game or picking up poker in the first place is progress, learning something new, seeing yourself success in it or succeed in it. And what happens in No Limit Hold'em is a lot of people already reached quote unquote their peak and they can only become this much better. If you reach a certain peak in a game, it doesn't really matter, even outside of poker, in a sport or in a video game or in poker, you reach a certain peak. In order to become better, you have to put a tremendous amount of effort that is usually disproportional to the rewards you're going to gain. So by jumping into a new game or variation, you get this high and this feel of success again, of learning something new, succeeding at the field, having new ideas, being creative again. And I think that is what jumping into Omaha can also give you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Fernando, for a very interesting conversation about PLO. It's been most instructive, and I hope that everybody's appetite has been whetted for the game and they will want to rush out and get this book. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.